Thank you. Thank you very much, Nathan. Before we begin, I want to honor the prior inhabitants of this area, the Ohlone Indians. And I want to make this statement, and we'll have a moment of silence. We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that we are located on the ancestral Ohlone peoples who inhabited what is now the San Francisco Peninsula. The greater ancestral territory of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, have lived in and moved through this area, anthropologists say, for over 10,000 years. We recognize that as the original stewards of this land, the Ohlone of all things and maintained harmony for millennia. We honor our Mother Earth. As the indigenous stewards of this land and in accordance with their traditions, these tribes or forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this land. Recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging these indigenous occupants and affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Please join us in a moment of silence. Today, we welcome a sister, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, known for her research and lifelong commitment to national and international social justice issues. Roxanne, 2017 Lannan Cultural Freedom Prize, and an acclaimed author of many books, including An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which won the 2015 American Book Award. Today, she will speak about her new book to be released in August called Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Extinction. Roxanne will speak for 40 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. And Robin Larson will read them out. Please try to make your questions brief and to the point so we can hear from as many of you as possible. And a warm welcome, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz.
Thank you, Dolores. Thank everyone for coming today. Appreciate being invited to finally be speaking at the Unitarian Universalist Church in San Francisco. Only a few blocks from where I live, but now in cyberspace. This had been planned to take place in person last April. Hopefully soon we will meet in person. Well, I spent years quarantined writing a book, which will be published in August, titled Not a Nation of Immigrants. Wonderful publisher, Beacon Press. As I'm sure you know, the Unitarians own Beacon Press, and it's one of the best publishers in the country, one of the oldest. So today I want to present a preview of this book by talking about one of the chapters of the book titled Yellow Peril. I'm sure you are aware of the year-long accelerated assault on people of Asian descent across the country, including in our Bay Area. Having spent some months researching and writing this chapter in my book, I became aware of the deep historical roots of anti-Asian ideology that emerged in Christian Europe and has seen its most extreme form in the United States during the past 200 some years. So the discovery in Wuhan, China of COVID-19 in the fall of 2019 and its detection in the United States 2 months later brought on a barrage of xenophobia and attacks, actual physical attacks against Asian Americans. During the year 2020, there were 2,800 reports of harassment against Asian Americans in the United States, with some 240 physical assaults, several ending in death. And these continue in 2021. Princeton professor Anne Anlin Cheng observes, this recent onslaught of anti-Asian violence can partly be attributed to our former president, who spoke nonstop of the Chinese virus and even Kung flu, but he could not have rallied the kind of hatred that he did without this country's long history of systemic and cultural racism against people of Asian descent. Aiko Day points out that the attacks reveal the fraudulence of the model minority myth and the assimilationist paradigm that legitimizes state violence against Black and brown bodies, trying to pit Asian Americans against other people of color. Day argues that anti-Asian racism in the United States indicates something deeper that is ingrained in the US capitalist system. She writes, the idea of Asians, particularly the Chinese, as viral transmitters of disease is part of a longer history of romantic anti-capitalism that remains a key ideology of white settler colonialism in North America. The United States was the first state birthed as a capitalist state, the fiscal military state, and since the 1850s has constituted the largest economy in the world, dependent on first enslaved African labor, then immigration to meet the needs of industrial production. Yet immigration has always been fraught with suspicion of newcomers, none more extreme than xenophobia. Although democracy is equated with the ideology of capitalism and free markets, a deep strain of white nationalism demonizes globalization and especially focuses on China. For white nationalists, only the restoration of white racial purity can save the planet. These racial rantings appear extreme, but they form the bedrock of white settler ideology and fear of white disappearance. As Eikode stresses, targeting Asia and mainly China as the source of disease in the world did not begin with COVID-19. Asian flu is a given. Flu, if one says flu, that word Asian actually pops into the mind spontaneously. It's so given to most in the West. Although the deadly 1918-1919 flu pandemic originated in Kansas in the United States, and since then from several locales. The 1996 mad cow virus originated in England. During the 1876 smallpox outbreak in San Francisco, the 30,000 Chinese residents were branded as a laboratory of infection and quarantined, not allowed out of Chinatown. Renewed calls to exclude Chinese immigration contributed to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Marie Myung-Ok Lee writes, this yellow peril, pest-adjacent imagery of Asians remains deeply embedded in our national psyche. When COVID-19 appeared in the liberal San Francisco Bay Area, the University of California, Berkeley Student Health Center stated in writing that fear of interacting with those who might be from Asia is a common and normal reaction to fears of the virus. But it's not only about disease. In 2015, President Barack Obama announced a pivot to China for the US military and national security apparatus. His successor, President Donald Trump, doubled down on the move, imposing tariffs and positioning warships, claiming US dominance in the South China Sea. The 2021 Democratic Party ascendance to the presidency showed no signs of ratcheting down the suspicions of China's actions and motives. So abuse of Asian elders on the West Coast actually increased in early 2021. Yellow peril took on a more dangerous turn with the growth of China's economy coming to rival that of the United States. The US economy being 40.75% of the world's economy, while having only 4% of the world's population, and China with 19% of the world's population, holding 34.27% in 2019. The trope of Wuhan virus added to the economic panic of a weakened US empire reliant more on the military to maintain world dominance than on maintaining or developing its economic power. The fear and demonization of Asia and Asian people are acute in the United States in the 21st century, as has been the case for nearly 2 centuries of US existence and much longer for Europeans. As a precursor to European colonization of the rest of the world, explorer Marco Polo traveled in Asia from 1271 to 1295, remaining in China for 17 of those years. Polo told of the danger he perceived that the Chinese presented to the West. He saw the Chinese people as regimented and communally oriented, writing, "From these qualities, so essential to the formation of soldiers, it is that they are fitted to subdue the world." But the Western belief that the Chinese threatened European civilization and Christianity was a justification for European expansion, domination, and colonization. The moniker Yellow Peril can be traced to the 1880s when German Kaiser Wilhelm II referred to Yellow Peril following a dream in which he saw the Buddha riding a dragon threatening to invade Europe. Boy, talk about paranoia. Sometimes it's called yellow terror or yellow specter. Liang Wing-Fai writes that the concept blends Western anxieties about sex, racist fears of the alien other, and the belief that the West will become outnumbered and enslaved by the East. So Western European and United States imperialist actions came to dominate China by the 1850s, creating famine and poverty. The 1948 Chinese Communist Revolution's success in throwing off Western dominance recharged Yellow Peril with the Cold War US Red Scare. In 1956, a best-selling book explained the horrors inventing the term Oriental despotism. The author, German-American self-appointed expert on China, Karl August Wittfogel, published Oriental Despotism, a comparative study of total power. Under the scholarly guise of a dubious comparative study of irrigation system and the Inca, along with the Muslim caliphates and the Mughal period in South Asia, But actually the focus of the screed is clearly despotic China, about total power and total terror. No examples of this is given in his book or in most of these arguments. We don't see Chinese gunboats on our shores, and the South China Sea does not belong to the United States. Yellow Peril centered on China, but also included the entire Asian continent and North Africa. In the late 1970s, Palestinian scholar Edward Said conceptualized Orientalism to critique Western views of the Middle East, principally the Arab Muslim world, as one of harems, opulence, polygamy, and domineering patriarchs. But his thesis also gives insight into Western conceptions of that entire vast continent that is peopled by the majority of humanity, of which Western Europe forms a tiny Western peninsula. European colonialism ideologically reduced Asian societies to ancients, people of ancient history who began civilizations but stopped developing with European ascendants and were viewed as sick and decayed. Said writes that Orientalism expresses the relationship between Occident and Orient as a relationship of power, of domination, of varying degrees of a complex hegemony, the hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, themselves reiterating European superiority over perceived Oriental backwardness, of course, rather than Western colonialism, creating that backwardness. Orientalism is an ideological tool of imperialism. Said writes, neither imperialism nor colonialism is a simple act of accumulation and acquisition. Both are supported and perhaps even impelled by impressive ideological formations that include notions that certain territories and people require and beseech domination, as well as forms of knowledge affiliated with domination, with words and concepts like inferior or subject races, subordinate peoples, dependency, expansion, and authority. US wars and occupations of Korea and Southeast Asia, initiated soon after the end of World War II, and the successful Chinese Revolution of 1948 that ousted Western domination, were all about containing China. Since the 1979 Iranian Revolution that ousted the US and Europe's main man in West Asia, the Shah, the US has been at war throughout the Middle East and North Africa, demonizing Muslims as terrorists to be killed. Given the famines and chaos of imperialist interventions in China, including the Opium Wars that forced opium trade on the Chinese people, mass exodus of immigrants from China from the mid-19th century into the 20th century should come as no surprise. Few of those fleeing sought promised lands, rather survival, as China sank into a colonized backwater. Many Chinese migrants to the United States, mostly men, sent a portion of their earnings from gold seeking or labor back to families at home, living under dire circumstances. The first Chinese individuals who arrived in the United States in large numbers were men joining thousands, tens of thousands of others from around the world and from every part of the United States in the 1950s to seek wealth in the gold fields of Northern California. The first Chinese gold seekers numbered around 300, arriving in Northern California in 1849. Then more than 400 joined them. The numbers increased every year so that in 1852, there were some 20,000 Chinese men in the goldfields. With the construction of the first Continental Railroad beginning in 1865, Chinese workers were recruited, and in 1870, there were 63,000 Chinese in the United States, 3/4 in California, and other parts of the country along the railroad routes, as well as in northeastern cities. By 1870, Chinese immigrants made up 9% of the California population, where they comprised 1/4 of the entire workforce. And initially, during the gold rush and railroad building, the Chinese had to reside in rural areas. But in the later 19th century, they became increasingly urban. By 1900, nearly half of all Chinese in California lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. Although Chinese workers made up a large part of the labor force in California, some 40% of Chinese residents in San Francisco and Sacramento were shopkeepers and merchants, along with a significant number of professionals and artisans. By 1900, half the Chinese population in the United States lived in California, while 15,000 were developing Chinatowns in the cities of the Northeast. Historian Ronald Takaki observed that as the first Asian group to immigrate to the United States in substantial numbers, close attention needs to be paid to what happened to them in the second half of the 19th century, as their treatment set the template for how immigrants from other Asian countries would be viewed and treated. Clearly, suspicion of Asians continued, leading to the incarceration of US citizens of Japanese descent during World War II. Leland Stanford was the 8th governor of the state of California, serving one 2-year term. He took office in 1862 in the midst of the US Civil War. As a member of the party of Lincoln, a liberal Republican, he would become one of the big 4 railroad barons, along with Charles Crocker, Mark Hopkins, and Collis P. Huntington. In his inaugural address as governor, he said, "To my mind, it is clear that the settlement among us of an inferior race is to be discouraged by every legitimate means. Asia, with her numberless millions, sends to our shores the dregs of her population. Large numbers of this class are already here, and unless we do something early to check their immigration, the question, which of the 2 tides of immigration meeting upon the shores of the Pacific shall be turned back, will be forced upon our consideration when far more difficult than now of disposal. There can be no doubt but that the presence of numbers among us of a degraded and distinct people must exercise a deleterious influence upon the superior race, and to a certain extent, repel desirable immigration. It will afford me great pleasure to concur with the legislature to any constitutional action having for its object the repression of the immigration of the Asiatic races." At the time Stanford spoke those racist words, there were only 35,000 Chinese immigrants among the United States' 31 million population, most of whom, along with tens of thousands of other non-US citizens, had joined the gold rush in Northern California in the 1850s. 5 weeks after Stanford's inauguration, the US Congress and Lincoln administration approved an act to prohibit the coolie trade by American citizens in American vessels. This then was to curb any immigration by Chinese. However, a year later, Stanford and his business partners were recruiting Chinese workers from China to build the Transcontinental Railroad, ignoring the prohibition Stanford had initiated. Indeed, profits from cheap labor appeared to soften Stanford's yellow peril paranoia after he had done great damage. With the 1862 Congressional Pacific Railway Act, the Central Pacific Railway Company was chartered to build the western portion, starting in Sacramento. Work began in the fall of 1863, cutting through the Sierra Nevada mountain chain, blasting out 15 separate tunnels and trestles across deep canyons. In the beginning, the workers were white, but they began abandoning the dangerous and hard work and living conditions. The railroad barons decided to recruit Chinese workers, and by 1865, Chinese men made up the majority of the workforce. Stanford wrote President Andrew Johnson, "Without them, it would be impossible to complete the western portion of this great national enterprise." In 1865, Stanford praised the Chinese workers as quiet, peaceable, industrious, economical, ready and apt to learn all of different kinds of work. Stanford's partner, Charles Crocker, even went so far as to proclaim, "They prove nearly equal to white men in the amount of labor they perform and are much more reliable." He added, most surely the most important of all, no danger of strike among them. Of course, they had no legal rights and were not citizens. Within 2 years, Crocker imported 12,000 Chinese workers, 90% of the entire workforce. The savings in hiring Chinese rather than white workers was huge. Chinese workers made $31 a month and were on their own in obtaining food and lodging, while white workers would have required higher pay and their room and board covered, which would have increased labor costs by a third. Historian Manu Karuka, in his extraordinary book, Empire's Tracks, writes, "To be a Chinese worker on the Central Pacific was definitely not to be a slave, the property of another. It was, however, a reduction to the status of a tool for grading earth and drilling a mountain. It was to be expendable, interchangeable, replaceable. Chinese workers were instruments of labor, constant capital for the Central Pacific Railroad Company." Historian Gordon Chang makes the important observation that China was embedded in the vision of a transcontinental railroad from the moment it manifested as a possibility in the 1840s. One of its foremost boosters was the wealthy US merchant Asa Whitney, who made a fortune in China in the 1840s through the lucrative and unbalanced export trade. He and other railroad boosters like Thomas Hart Benton saw the Intercontinental Railroad as the extension of continental imperialism to overseas imperialism, in which the US would dominate the Pacific. The railroad was also a colonial process of ethnic cleansing, the federal government taking indigenous lands guaranteed by treaties to hand over to the railroad tycoons. Soon after Chinese railroad labor was no longer needed, Chinese exclusion was implemented. The railroad and exclusion were core infrastructures of continental imperialism. US imperialism had long extended to Latin America and the Caribbean, starting with their independence movement soon after US independence, and the US forcing, through war, Mexico to transfer half its territory to the United States. By the 1870s, the elites in those countries were hosts to US and British mining interests and yellow peril paranoia and exclusion that accompanied Chinese, Japanese, and South Asian immigration. In the 19th century, the demand for workers on Hawaiian plantations and agribusiness in California drew Japanese labor migrations. Around 30,000 Japanese had entered California by 1900, and within a decade, more than 100,000 more migrants had arrived. With labor shortages in the California fields, labor recruiters lured Japanese workers in Hawaii to California. The 1910 census tallied 41,000 Japanese in California, less than 1% of the population, but enough to cause yellow peril alarm, with exclusionists calling for restrictions. The anti-Japanese movement was much like the anti-Chinese, focused on perceived threat to health and morality of the white population, but the real fear was economic and the effect on white workers. In 1908, a year after anti-Asian riots took place up and down the Pacific coast from San Francisco to British Columbia, President Theodore Roosevelt called for unity of action among the Anglo states of the United States, Canada, Australia, and Britain to promote a white Pacific, which he called a white Pacific in capital letters, in which white supremacy would dominate against ascendant Japanese power. Roosevelt dispatched the US Navy's 16 battleship Pacific tour to demonstrate Anglo unity against the yellow peril that Japanese immigration represented. Roosevelt told a reporter for the New York Times that the fleet would confirm that New Zealand and Australia were white men's countries. Until 1875, the only legal guide to US immigration was the Race-Based Naturalization Act of 1790, which allowed citizenship only to free white persons, a measure that remained on the books until the 1952 Walter McCarran Act. People simply arrived, many of them aggressively recruited for newly ethnically cleansed territories seeking statehood, which desperately needed settlers to outnumber the indigenous peoples who were being driven out or forced into reservations. In 1875, the US Supreme Court declared that regulation of immigration was a federal matter, but did not specify the terms of immigration. The Immigration Service was established only in 1891. Tellingly, the first federal immigration law, which created the foundation for US immigration, was based on exclusion. It is crucial to recognize that when and how immigration as such began, it was based on overt, blatant racism. And that law was the Chinese Exclusion Act of May 6, 1882, which suspended Chinese immigration for a 10-year period and barred resident Chinese from US citizenship. And in 1902 was renewed indefinitely. The laws were widely evaded. In fact, Chinese labor was recruited. Exclusion was repealed by the Magnuson Act of December 17, 1943, which allowed only 105 Chinese individuals to enter per year. In the 1924 immigration law, practically all immigration from Asia, as well as Eastern and Southern Europe, was prohibited, also including Japan, with a quota set of 165,000 for all of Asia. This was, in the words of the authors, to preserve the ideal of US homogeneity. What is less known than official and generalized exclusion and discrimination against Chinese is the corruption and the development of the US workers' movements, the unionization movement of the late 19th century. John Kuo-Wei Tan, historian of the New York Chinese experience in the 19th century, identifies an omen in 1870 of anti-Chinese furor that would lead to the next decade Chinese exclusion. It was also a harbinger of the developing white supremacy in the nascent trade union movement, which also excluded Black people. This was a lengthy front page article in the main liberal Republican newspaper in the country. And remember, the Republicans were still the Liberal Party, Democrats were the reactionaries. The New York Tribune, written by chief editor and future prominent labor organizer John Swinton, an immigrant from Ireland, in fact, a refugee, one of the famine refugee people who came in the 1840s. Eschewing debates over coolies in the workforce, what he called coolies, Swinton addressed that he deemed unresolvable racial differences that led to a recent anti-Chinese protest. The deepest, he wrote in the paper, the deepest dividing line between men is that of race. Deeper than politics or religion, deeper than contemporary differences of laws or manners are the depths and differences of race. The people of the United States are the white European race, from which have sprung the Germanic, Celtic, and Latin varieties, all immediately related to each other by historical terms, all growing side by side for thousands of years and all developing a progressive civilization through the changes of time. Swinton argued that labor must unite with capital to fight the scourge of the Chinese against the threat of infusion and transfusion of the Chinese, Mongolian, or yellow race with the white American race. He claimed that experts were in agreement that, quote, the Mongolian blood is a depraved and debased blood. The Mongolian type of humanity is an inferior type, inferior in organic structure, in vital force of physical energy, and in the constitutional conditions of development. Historian Matthew Fry Jacobson writes, quote, an Irish immigrant in 1877 could be a despised Celt in Boston, a threat to the Republic, and yet a solid member of the Order of Caucasians for the Extermination of the Chinamen in San Francisco, gallantly defending US shores from an invasion of Mongolians. No one represented this more than Dennis Kearney right here in San Francisco, another Irish immigrant. He enacted the capsule description of the vile anti-Chinese obsession of white workers in the late 19th and early 20th century. The majority of the opposition to Chinese and Japanese immigration originated in labor unions, and especially from Dennis Kearney's Working Men's Party on the West Coast. Their ravings warned of dire perceived threats to health and morality of the white population. The white supremacy of white workers barred any thought of organizing Asian workers. Across the country in the mid-1870s, there was a high unemployment and economic depression. Workers' rallies in San Francisco led to the formation of the Working Men's Party, California in 1877, led by Kearney. Anti-Chinese immigration was at the top of the organization's agenda, and the party's slogan being, "The Chinese must go." The following year, the party won 11 seats in the California Senate and 17 in the state assembly, playing a leading role in rewriting the state constitution and denying Chinese citizens voting rights, which was later overturned as being unconstitutional. But it had the desired effect 5 years later with the federal Chinese Exclusion Act. Jack London was a leading anti-Chinese bigot in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he was born in 1876. London was not only a white working man's advocate, but also an active and radical Marxist and socialist, and a member of the Socialist Party, which was very radical at that time. Thanks to his best-selling books, he became a very wealthy man and was very influential and admired around the world as a writer. In all of his speeches and political writing, even in his fiction, London railed against Chinese immigration. Like most of the elite and intellectuals of the progressive era, including those in the highest political office, such as Theodore Roosevelt, he embraced eugenics. In 1910, London published a story titled The Unparalleled Invasion in McClure's magazine, one of the most popular magazines of the time. It's a fantasy set in a future 1976. It tells a story of the West's recognition of China's enormous population and potential for world domination, and preventing it with an unparalleled invasion of biological warfare, the United States bringing biological warfare to China that resulted in the complete annihilation of the Chinese people. So this is a genocidal fantasy of Jack London. London certainly had a deep effect on people of all classes, particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area. In February 1905, the San Francisco Chronicle stoked public fear, warning of a raging torrent of Japanese. Sorry, I lost my... Well, I'm going to end there because I had a few more remarks, but I think I will end there because the time is getting short and I would like to hear from other people in the conversation. I hope this history has been interesting. I see that I haven't been in the picture. Somehow it has stayed on you, Dolores, this whole time, even though I'm speaking. I don't know how that happened, but. You're muted.
Yeah, I think most people can see you in the, if you go to gallery, if you click on gallery up on in the upper right-hand corner, which says view.
Oh, that's okay. Let's just start with the questions now.
Okay. Robin, are there any questions that you can?
I'm sorry to say that there are 3 messages about our freezing issue, which we'll discuss afterward. We'll try to figure out why we had so much freezing of sound and image. So really, actually, I will ask a question. It's more personal. It was related to the title of your new book, Not a Nation of Immigrants. And with the subtitle about how settlers and colonials were not exactly immigrants. And yet in the Middle West, in the sort of history of my family, there was a lot of pride about being a settler, about getting to Nebraska and when it was raw and new and on grass, as high as a man. And so it was hard for me to first, I mean, I had a sort of defensive reaction, and I'm wondering if you've encountered that from other people families who prided themselves on being settlers in sort of unwelcoming places.
You mean because there were Indians that didn't want them there, right?
No. Well, yes, the Indians didn't want them there for sure, but then they also, the actual conditions were very unwelcoming. Blizzards, prairie fires, grasses. So go ahead.
I also come from a settler family. The Dunbars, Scots-Irish, first settled in Appalachia and then made the trek from Kentucky to Missouri to Oklahoma. So that's what a settler is. Settler colonialism is the structure of the United States, so that it was written into the Constitution that these were the only citizens. And there were mainly Scots-Irish, a few Catholic Irish, but not really until the 1840s. German Americans, a great many, almost, and in fact, they almost made German a second language. There were so many German settlers. but it was definitely, you know, Western European Anglo, of course, majority Anglo settlers. And then once the United States was founded, it took 100 years for these settlers to, they were given free land, you know, Indian land. The military and Indian killing militias, settler militias, paved the way and then brought settlers in. Often settlers were brought in while Native people were just there, just moved in and pushed the Native people. I think one thing people don't understand because of the distortion of how US history is taught is that 99% of Native people in what became the United States were subsistent farmers. They weren't just roving around in forests. They had completely transformed the continent, the grasslands that they controlled with fire before, you know, fire controlled the settlers. And they were very, they had developed roads, they had curated the forests so that they didn't raise livestock. The deer, the animals came to them in their backyards because they enticed them there. They, in the east of the Mississippi, they imported buffaloes that also were used for meat. So it was a very, you know, advanced civilizations that were appropriated, that were taken from the Native people, already developed. There's no way that they could have taken a wilderness. That didn't happen anywhere in the Americas or anywhere that Europeans colonized in the world. They appropriated the wealth that was already there. So they had to have settlers. This was the first settler colony. Well, Ireland, the British created Ireland into a settler colony. And that was the template for moving out, pushing out the indigenous peoples as they did in Ulster, where then the Anglo and Scots-Irish, Scots settlers that were brought in outnumbered the Irish in Ulster, and to this day, that's, you know, still a problem. But it's a very obvious one. But most U.S. people don't deal with the fact that they're descendants from settlers. So that's what settler colonialism is. Immigration, as I said, didn't even wasn't in the Constitution. It was mainly just the Alien Act was to keep people out. Especially French people, because they disapproved of the French Revolution. So it, even though the monarchy, the French monarchy had supported the revolution, but then the, you know, French Revolution was not to the very conservative US founders' taste at all. But they needed settlers in order to take the land. And from the very beginning, they did have, and they wrote about the one reason for their wanting to take the continent, the main reason for taking the continent was to reach the Pacific and get to China, to take the wealth of China. So this was always a part of the motive, was the control of the wealth of an abundance of China. And so the Pacific was always in the future, and this was taking of half of Mexico in 1848 after 2 years of brutal war against Mexico, actually occupying Mexico City and holding the government hostage, forcing them to sign a treaty. So, you know, my book is about a lot also about the border, how it was formed and how it is illegal. The border with Mexico is illegal because it was a forced treaty. And it's, you know, it's already in the news now, you know, the unclean people coming in with COVID. I just heard on the news this morning, this, you know, really racist Republican raving about Biden allowing these diseased children
Yes.
to come
I
into the
read that
country.
news.
So this is, you know, this is not, yeah. But it's, you know, it is, if you see now, like the 75,000 people who supported Trump, and I've tried to do some demographic studies of these people and their origins. I would say that they're about 90% descendants of original settlers, that they are, you know, largely a part of Scots-Irish. And I come from that, you know, I come from rural Oklahoma, and that I recognize them. Some of them were probably my relatives. So I have a kind of dual insight. So they're a problematic group of people, the descendants of these settlers, who believe they've been overwhelmed, you know, and the system always needed these settlers, but often they were landless and they kept moving on because they couldn't compete with the slaveholders for labor.
Yeah.
To produce commercial. All agriculture that was created in the United States by settlers was commercial, like cotton mainly, a commercial crop.
I'm gonna break you up a little bit here because I've got 1, 2, 3,
Yeah.
4, 5 lengthy questions that have just come in the
Right.
last 5 minutes. And one I can't read, and I don't know why. It seems as if it's cut off. It starts with racist or oppressive ideas and actions diminish our collective life. Do you have a sense of who we might name and honor who's challenged some of these ideas with courage?
That was me. That's partly just sort of an extension of the conversation, and it's lovely to have you with us. I'm so glad to have you with us.
Could you repeat your question?
Sure.
I didn't quite get the first part.
Some of it is cut off on my chat, Vanessa. Sorry.
Well, you know, just to, in response, right now in the city of San Francisco in the Bay Area, we're seeing the renaming of parks and schools and streets as part of our kind of historic reckoning, right, with those folks whose racist or oppressive ideas or actions we feel have diminished our collective life. So we don't want, you know, we don't want them to be the ones marking the city. And so there's been lots of conversation about that in action. And I guess I have a question in light of that, who you think we might name and honor who challenged some of those ideas with courage, or who were leaders in their, you know, in the Indigenous community or in the, you know, Asian American community, who we can hold up, because we're going to need to rename some streets and some parks and some schools and tell a different history.
Well, I'm not a great advocate of statutory. Statutory is, you know, the United States is from the beginning, you know, promotes extreme individualism, and the people I hold up, you know, as role models for me in my life, and the people I see now coming up are people who are parts of communities and collectives, and not, you know, out. I mean, look what they've made of Martin Luther King, who is a radical revolutionary. They've made him into this bland person who made about a dream. And it almost, you know, reduces him to stone, literally. So I have this qualm about, of course, I think every Columbus statue should go and not be replaced with anything. most of them, you know, I think they should go and not be replaced with anything. You know, not rename. Of course, you can't rename something that's already there. These, you know, if you read James Lowen's wonderful book, Lies Across America, he wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me, and people are very familiar with, but his Lies Across America are about these statuaries, and it's almost all private donors, you know, private organizations, and all the Confederate ones are the Daughters of the Confederacy, who erected all of those Confederate statues in the 1920s. So that there's nothing sacred about any of them, but there are also, you know, buildings named for donors, you know, for people who donated to the building being built. It's all private stuff, you know, and they take up public space, and cities, you know, kowtow to them and you know, just allow them to do that. So I think we should, you know, honor. I mean, we're putting Harriet Tubman on a $20 bill. I don't think she would have probably liked that at all, because she was certainly not a capitalist kind of person herself. But it would be nice to, you know, just have money with flowers, or, you know, flowers or landscapes or something instead of people on them. So I don't know. I think there are so many, you know, so many great people here in the Bay Area. In the past, I think of the people who led the International Hotel, the I Hotel, where the Filipino retired workers lived, you know, and had community in that fight. So there are many people, you know, Filipinos here in the Bay Area, who, you know, some kind of monument to that cause. And there is, I mean, there's actually a building they got, you know, in Chinatown, but that's the sort of thing, I think, you know, having this wonderful meeting place that honors the I Hotel is much better than a, you know, statue. I think we should get away from, you know, honoring individuals so much and creating heroes, and really focus on communities and the contributions made to communities. And that was the beauty of Martin Luther King himself, you know, and William Barber, Reverend William Barber today is one of my heroes, and he's trying to do the same thing. He's constantly on the go, talking to, I ran into him at the Los Angeles Book Fair at the University of Southern California. He wasn't there, but I went across the street to a Starbucks to get coffee off campus. And there he was with a cluster of only about 10 people just talking. So yeah, I guess, I hope you get my point, you know, how the individualism and the heroes, I'd like to see them all come down and know what to do. And naming schools, I like New York style of numbers. I would love to have gone to number 29 or something.
I went to PS 41.
Oh, good. I like that.
Here's another question. Let's see now. This one's, how can people who are descendants of white settlers, we've talked about this a bit, maybe this is more about the descendants of white settlers, begin to transform our relationships and stance toward the world as a means of deconstructing settler culture and practices? And do you have any thoughts on embracing transfigurative politics, supporting land back campaigns? Land back?
Land back.
Oh, okay, all right. now I seem to, okay, land back campaigns. Oh, damn, I seem to have lost it. This somehow Zoom has a way of slipping away from you just when you want it.
I think I got it. I got the idea.
Okay.
I think what descendants of original settlers can do is tell the truth, learn the truth, and then tell the truth about their lineage, and have get involved, you know, in something like land back. Land back is the slogan for a movement that is not new. It's a sort of new moniker for restitution of land taken illegally outside of treaties from Native people. Most of that land is not in private hands. It is actually what's called the public lands, federal lands, state parks, state lands, national parks, land grant colleges, railroad. When the railroads, they didn't just take, you know, the narrow, let's say the width of the tracks and, you know, some to the side. They took thousands, tens of thousands of acres on each side, and then sold those plots and made even more money. This was a land grab all over the continent. And the reason the federal government cannot sell public lands is because they don't own the public lands. The federal government does not own Yellowstone Park or Yosemite or Grand Canyon or the Bureau of Land Management lands, because these lands were taken without treaty, and by their own laws, they don't own it, and they need to restore it. These were the national parks were the most sacred areas. They chose the most sacred areas to Native people and then drove the Native people out. So they're not even able to use these most sacred areas, and they can defile them in any way. Like when Trump came in, he took away the very precarious designation of Bears Ear immediately and introduced mining there. I think that has been reversed, but it's still precarious. It should just simply be transferred to the Navajo Nation and the Pueblo Native people as their own, so it can no longer be shifted around by administrations. So that's what land back is, restoring the restitution, so that Native communities, Native nations can have can build, you know, build actual cities and infrastructure. Half the Native people have to live off of Native land because there aren't the resources there. They have to live in either nearby cities or other cities for jobs. So that's, even the reservations themselves are precarious because they're under trust. Native people are still colonized. They're trust in a trust relationship with the U.S. government. They do not have title to their land. It belongs to the federal government, and which allows them. So that's colonialism, and that needs to be changed, because it would only take an act of Congress to do away completely. They did that in the 1950s, the Termination Act, to do away with all.
I'm going to interrupt you, Flo, because you're fascinating, and everybody's learning a great deal by everything you say. On the other hand, we have at least three more questions to ask you. This is a question that's to everyone, but it is, I think you could help us with. The Chinese 6 companies of San Francisco is the earliest civil rights organization in the US. They filed a large number of lawsuits challenging the unjust laws passed against them. One of the lawsuits that went up to the Supreme Court established the right of citizenship by birth. Please comment on the legal rights by the Chinese and other immigrant groups against unjust laws. Legal fights by the Chinese and other immigrant groups against unjust laws.
Yeah, there's, you know, a long history of resistance and persistence in gaining the rights, you know, the legal rights, but that does not necessarily, you know, with the again with the settler population and even, you know, earlier immigrants, and the person who asked that question probably knows a great deal more about this resistance than I do, because the book that I did does not, you know, is one chapter on this. So it's more, you know, a history of U.S. policies and how immigrants are processed socially to, first of all, to embrace anti-Black racism. James Baldwin is, you know, is a great source for understanding how immigrants gain a certain whiteness if they're darker people, like say Sicilians, when they came in the early 20th century, were treated, you know, really called the N-word. They were made to sit in Catholic churches in the segregated Black section. And they overcame this with, you know, partly by developing anti-Black racism, and certainly the Irish. But it's a, you know, it's a tragic story of how of the constant contingency of immigrants. Descendants of old settlers have a complete confidence in their right to have stolen Indian land and taken the continent. They have no sense of contingency that maybe they shouldn't be there. But every immigrant that comes to the United States, and this really started with the Irish refugees, although they weren't considered immigrants and they didn't have to go through any processing in the 1840s, to the Eastern European and Southern European and Chinese, Asian immigration. And I go in the book, I go through how the Catholic Church itself became Americanized and participated in that process of whitening those Catholic populations. But that's another story. But I think the people who come from former colonies of Europe and former areas dominated, that is the non-European world, are always considered contingent in the United States. It's not that they lose those legal rights, it's that socially I saw, and it just brought me to tears, this young Chinese American woman on local television here in San Francisco, over in Oakland, saying, will we ever be accepted in this country? I mean, these are people, generations. She's generations of US citizens, and yet still treated as malignant foreigners. So there's a big influx after 1964, the Immigration Act that opened, still with quotas, but open immigration to what you could call third world, liberation from Africa and Asia, and more in Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean. So there are many, many books out now. I was just so impressed with the literature of these young immigrants, or who came here when they were pretty young, from the 1960s to now, that they're very angry. One met the South Asian immigrant, wrote a book called "This Land Is My Land," and he says he's very knowledgeable about the Native situation. So he explains that we are here because you were there. You destroyed our countries. You bombed our countries. He's talking about the West. And we have to take that into consideration, that these, especially Southeast Asian, who came as refugees, who also are victims of this anti-Asian, they don't differentiate people. You remember probably in Chicago when there was the anti-Japanese period because of the auto industry competing with Japanese cars, which were much better and cheaper and much better made than Detroit was making them. And so one of a auto worker shot what he thought was a Japanese person, and it was actually Chinese person, but they don't differentiate, it's Asian.
Here's a couple more questions.
Southeast Asians are.
Roxanne, could I ask you a question? My name is Dolores Perez Halbrun, and do you have any hope for the future that things may change now? And I'm always interested in policy and strategies to change policy. Do you think that a strategy for the Department of Education to demand that the textbooks explain the real history of this country to the children of the United States, and that it somehow seeps up to their parents, and that, because my experiences as a part Native American, my grandfather was a full-blooded Aztec married to a Spanish woman, and my mother was Irish and English. And when I would, be accosted and called names and stuff like that, and I was raised by this white family, and they were wonderful. They were just wonderful. But when I would tell them what happened, they were just they didn't know what to say. They were, I don't know if they were embarrassed, and they just would freeze it. I see that even today, I'm as old as I am, I see that sometimes with white people. They don't know, they look scared, or I end up feeling sorry for them because they do say such ridiculous things. So my question to you is, do you see any hope for the future? And I think it's going to take a lot of education. I think your books are going to help a lot. But, like even with my family, I can't say, read this book. They're not going to read it.
Dolores,
Embarrassed.
let her answer. We got 3 or 4 more other people who want to ask the question.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah. Education is so important. I'm encouraged, just watching the Indigenous people's history of the United States being embraced was published in 2014. And right away, it was just, it was really, really picked up by librarians and teachers who, seemed to be, it's the reason I wrote it, but I didn't expect such an embrace of it, because it's pretty radical. And then it was adapted to a young people's version in 2019. And that has really taken off. And I was invited to speak to a teachers group in New York. It was from all over New York State. Teachers came. They have this every year. As like about 5,000 teachers, K to 12, and they were all using this young people's book. And it just, I mean, it was jaw-dropping. I had no idea. I love teachers and librarians. I think they are the most important people in this country. Well, besides health workers, maybe. And this being, you know, International Women's Day tomorrow, I will throw in this part. They're mostly women. They're majority women as well. So this is, they're extremely important people and very much underpaid as a, you know, as a career. But I am encouraged. However, you know, politics comes into it. Texas is the largest buyer of textbooks in the country, and they pretty well decide whatever their reactionary school boards decide to approve, then becomes the standard textbook for the country. And most school boards in the country, they don't anymore require the teacher to use the textbook, but the federal government does not put in, you know, money to buy these textbooks if the school board, like Oakland School Board, has refused to use the Texas template textbooks, but they have to. Then the school district itself has to pay for the books that are used. So it's a kind of, you know, a conundrum. It's not just educational, it's also political. And this is why it's so important at every level of electoral politics, from dog catcher to president, to pay attention and put people in office, especially school boards. I hate seeing our San Francisco school board attacked so much because they're mostly people of color, and they are answering to student demands, for instance, and, you know, changing the names of schools and so forth. And they've been pilloried. So there's, you know, and even by the mayor, and it's really kind of disgusting. But they are progressive, and they you know, there's a backlash to that. So it's very, very difficult to get something through. But I mean, one has to be optimistic that there are answers, but it's going to take a great deal of energy on the part of a great many people to change anything.
Here are some questions that I'm going to sort of lump together about the indigenous people and about rectification of things gone wrong. How can the seizure of native lands be put back in native hands? What would be the best way, through Congress or other ways? And then just a general question about how much appreciated your critique of American narrative is, and how it's so much more complex than we were taught. And then a third concern is somewhat related to the native lands being put back, and that is, how do we work to become a pluralistic, diverse country? So it's how can the seizure of lands be put back in native hands to help repair the past? But then how can we work forward from here to become a more pluralistic and accepting and diverse country without so much racism floating out there, poisoning everybody?
Well, yeah, Congress is, you know, in the colonial system that controls Native people still. Congress is in control of everything having to do with Native people. And I might add that a very important cabinet appointment is Deb Haaland, Department of Interior. It is the Department of Interior that oversees all public lands, including Native American reservations. and lands. So that is going to be extremely important because she's not just a Native individual. She comes from Laguna, Pueblo in New Mexico, where land is more sacred, considered more sacred, I think, than any other Native people in North America. So that's encouraging. What she can do and what can be done with Congress is another matter. The Republicans, the Republican Party basically does not support public lands or Native lands. They want to privatize everything. They want to privatize Golden Gate Park. They want to privatize the National Park Service. Privatization is everything, and making money off of it. So it's, it really is not even a very few exceptions to that. In Murkowski, who's one of the few in Alaska, I just heard that Donald Trump is going to find a candidate to run against her in the primary in Alaska, so we may lose her. She understands Native lands and is very supportive. But it would have to be Congress, and Congress also controls, all the money. But the Department of Interior is extremely important. That's where the Bureau of Indian Affairs is located, always underfunded. And hopefully during Holland's tenure there, hopefully for 8 years, but even if it's 4 years, she'll be able at least to bring more resources to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service, and for Native goods.
Well, how can
as for this diversity, a more diverse and pluralistic, we already are demographically that. So but it's unbalanced, throughout the country. The big swath middle of the country is still mostly, especially the rural areas, still mostly descendants of the original settlers, or very processed white immigrants like Scandinavian immigrants and German. So they're not all reactionary by any means. And, in Oklahoma, where I come from, there are some amazing things going on. Of course, there's, a large Native population there and a fairly large African-American population. Oklahoma has also taken in, signed up as a refugee resettlement place. So there's a very large Vietnamese population there, some Iranians. So it's more diverse, and it seems to meet people. It's almost a kind of model of diversity that hasn't yet reached the political level of matching the social relations.
The fact
partly
that
because
out there,
but
even the numbers aren't.
Yeah. So, getting the politics to represent it is what's really difficult, because I think on the ground, there's really a lot of interchange and social relations that are really beautiful.
Okay, I think we are here's 2 more new messages. Okay. Somebody's saying we are a pluralistic, diverse country. The question, as Amanda Gorman challenged us, is whether we want to share it or shatter it. It's pretty right out there. And then here's another one. Portland, Oregon Public Schools use your book. Thank you for your work. And then here's a final, I think this may be the final, I'm sure I've missed some. But we are getting close to the end of your talk, right? We only have about 3 more minutes. Here is one about the textbooks of the 70s and 80s gave no indication that I, as a BIPOC, had anything to be proud of in terms of my own heritage. I wonder how BIPOC like myself would have benefited from truth-telling in history. I also wonder if many white kids would have asked their parents how their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents could have stood by while so many atrocities occurred. We would have a very different country.
Yeah, it's, it's difficult. People think kids have to be protected from the truth, and no baby is born telling lies. They see only truth until adults start reforming them to and not telling them the realities. So I think it is that, though people really don't know, I myself, as a historian and having gone through the educational system at an earlier time, I did my doctoral work at UCLA in history in the 1960s. But I can tell you, even at that level, graduate work in history in the 1960s, how little was taught at that time. And even less so, of course, the lower grades that you get, that the books that were used, there's almost all historians, 99% were white men. And they were basically telling their histories, their preferred histories. And documentation, when Native scholars started being able, getting doctorates and being able to publish books, thanks to, people like the Delorias, a whole strand of, family that goes back to publications and intellectuals that multiplied themselves. They began, these documents that that were being used were being curated to leave out so much, and this was, it was really a fake history. And Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was a primary U.S. historian, Harvard, in the 50s, he was the advisor to John F. Kennedy. He actually said that, history, U.S. history should be taught not, as it happened, as real, but as civics, of being patriotic. So that's basically what history has been. And patriotic to what? Patriotic to, white nationalism. So we haven't come very far from that time, but thank goodness, with Black history, with Mexican American, Chicanos, the period of the 1960s of upheaval that was made possible by the civil rights movement, and of course, the anti-war movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, is a very, I don't think any of us who were involved at the time realized that it would end, that it had a beginning and an end, but it did. And there was, then the counter-revolution started, boy, did it ever start in the 1970s. And by 1980, we got Ronald Reagan, as president. So that a lot has been reversed, or kept in place, but the cat was out of the bag, literally. You can't stuff those truths back in the bag and hide it, because it's out there. And so that's what's good about it. It is there. It's just giving people access, I think. And the division politically, and of course social media, where people, you know, fall into these rabbit holes of QAnon and other disinformation. People, human beings will make up things if they don't, you know, have the components for putting together, because that's how our brains work. We have to bring order to things. So a lot of religious practices, you know, are very, very distorting, of course, not the Unitarians, but some others, like the one I was raised in, Southern Baptist, that, you know, promote a kind of ignorance and worship of the pastor who's speaking through God, or God speaking through them. And so we have a lot of dysfunction in this country that is, makes it very difficult. And then we have a constitution that was never meant, you know, as a democracy. I agree with Republicans that, you know, this was never meant to be a democracy. It's a republic of elites. So we have to change that. And I think we should begin actually questioning the Constitution rather than considering it a sacred screed. It's not sacred. It was made by slave owners. So how could it be sacred? How could it even be useful at this time? So do we really need a Supreme Court? Start asking questions, you know, that lead to other conclusions.
Well, and we have reached past 2:30. We're now at 2:35. And you did want to end at 2:30, Roxanne. I know that we are all extremely grateful, and there are far more remarks and praise and excitement that I haven't been able to read aloud to all of you that are in the chat about all of the things that you've said that have been so stimulating and also interesting and new. So I'm just signing off on this. Nathan, are you going to come back in and say something?
No, thanks everyone for attending. Thanks Roxanne again. It was a wonderful discussion, and our next meeting will be on March 21st at 1 p.m.